So the topic of our panel is Texas water and the land. And in this recent drought, it seemed like it was the land and the people that survive off the land, in essence, that suffered the most. There was $8 billion in agricultural losses, and there's now an expectation in the Texas Water Plan that agriculture will use less, 20% less by 2060 water than they do now. I guess we could start with you, Commissioner. How is that increase in efficiency going to take place? And more importantly, where's the funding going to come from for it?
You know, when I think about the $8.3 billion losses in agriculture and timber associated with the worst single-year drought in our state's history, it really reinforces to me how valid the numbers are in our state water plan, projecting that we'll have a $116 billion loss in income and over 1 million jobs lost by the year 2060 if we do not develop the water resources that we need. So, you know, we see a lot of numbers, we see a lot of forecasts, but those seem to hit very close to home when you look just recent last year of what we suffered. Agriculture has done quite a bit over the last few years. Since 1974, the number of irrigated agriculture acres has declined by over 30%. The amount of water that's been used in irrigated agriculture during that same time frame has declined by over 40%. And yet our yields have doubled in cattle and cotton and corn. And so I think what you see here is a real valid example of how technology is leading the way. There were projections in the 1970s that said the Ogallala would be exhausted in the early 2000s if we continue doing what we're doing. Providers responded through technology, and we've had some great breakthroughs. And so there are many examples of technology, there are examples of conservation practices today that agriculture will continue to provide great solutions, workable solutions, all while providing a domestic food supply, something I think is important not only to us as a society, but to an economy as well.
Specifically, though, how are we going to get to that 20% reduction? I mean, if these people have already suffered an $8.3 billion loss, as you mentioned, where is some of the leadership and funding going to come from for that?
Well, from the private sector primarily. We have a very good example. Village Farms invested about $45 million in Texas. They built a 30-acre greenhouse. That greenhouse has 30 times the yield over field-grown tomatoes, using 87% less water. These are the tangible ways. SeaWorld, in cooperation with Saws, has had a significant reduction in water. And so the funding for our water plan, I think, is going to come through private sector investment in new technologies, and it's going to come from the way that it always has. We have a user-pay system in Texas, and that has built the water capacity that we need, and we have to recognize the state has a role, but primarily the local water entities are the ones that are leading the charge. We just had the drought, single-year drought of record, and every municipality had the water they needed. Sometimes it had to be trucked in. Sometimes they had to take emergency measures, but because of local leadership and local planning, problems were solved, and it reinforces why we need to build new water capacity and do it in a way that accommodates the growth, that's sensitive to our environment, and balances the needs.
Just so a little bit about the predicate of agricultural water use. For those of you that don't know, agriculture uses the largest amount of water of any water user, at about 60% in Texas and 70% around the world. And the reason that we talk about the ability to conserve in agriculture is because technology has allowed us to conserve an awful lot of water just through changing out the irrigation technologies that are used. So we know how to do soil sensors, we know how to make sure that these systems are watering where and when they're needed, not just because it's 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning. And so technology has been a super good friend to conservation in the ag industry. There's no question that we need to protect that industry in Texas. In fact, one of the things I think it's important to stay right up front is we've got to figure out how do we optimize the use of water for food and energy in growing cities in Texas. We're not going to pick one over the other. A growing population is going to want to eat, drink, and turn the lights on, so it's not a question of choosing one use over the other. I think there is room in the state water plan for the state itself to assist in this changeover from older irrigation systems to newer irrigation systems. Right now, the state of Texas, through the Texas Water Development Board, has a whole series of loan programs that already exist and are available to local utilities as well as the agricultural industry. And the loan program that is available for the ag industry to replace irrigation equipment is a relatively undersubscribed program. So to my way, and by the way, voters increased the ability of the state of Texas to loan out these grants and so forth last year. So it's a $6 billion figure for the state of Texas. If we were to take those programs and reconfigure them around today's priority, understanding that agriculture is the highest water use, so any amount of water you can save in that block is going to be your most important and cheapest set of water to get back into the supply stream, I'd go look at those programs and realign them and make sure that they are structured such that the agricultural community will use them. And in that way, I think Texas can sit side by side with private sector and help get this turnover to new equipment happening faster.
What about the choice? Oh, did you have something to add? Sorry.
Yes, piggyback on both those comments and Senator Hager this morning, because it's not just technology, it's also changing strategies, and I include changing crops with strategies. He mentioned that he had stopped rice farming and pretty much into dryland corn now. Our family, my great-grandfather brought 3 Aberdeen Angus cows from Scotland in 1890, and all of the cows on our 6th-generation family ranch go back to those same 3 cows. And I can tell you that since 1890, we have planned for drought and have been surprised when it rains. So if you realign your thinking a little bit so that you are have drought on your mind when you're planning, not only about which crop to grow or whether to switch from irrigated or dry land, but listen, the advice and the funding used to be for tear everything native up and plant improved grasses, which needed not only water but fertilizer as well. And we realized 30 or so years ago that that wasn't the right thing to do, so now we are back to the way nature intended for it to be in the particular ecosystem that we're in the hill country. So without really any incentives or without any government programs, we just figured it out on our own that we needed to change the way we were doing things to more closely match what nature was providing for us. So you can change your management strategies and be ahead of technology as well.
Well, let's talk about groundwater for a minute. Before we do surface water, I just pulled up some statistics today from the Texas Water Development Board website. We have a very good idea of what our surface water supplies are like. But for instance, Lake Medina is now at, I believe, 24%. Sorry, that's 12%. OH Ivy is at 24%. But with groundwater, which is so heavily relied on for agriculture, how clear of a picture do we have of our groundwater supplies, and how rapidly are we going through them?
Well, I think I should say, because I may be channeling for Andy Sansom right now, groundwater and surface water are actually the same water. So the first thing we've got to establish, and they're regulated differently and the law treats them differently, but from an ecological standpoint, they're highly interchangeable. So whenever we talk about the use of groundwater and its drawdown for agricultural purposes, I think it's important to recognize that it's interrelated with the surface water that's in and around that.
You know, we do know in a lot of areas what the groundwater capacity is. Edwards Aquifer has a pretty good handle on the limitations that are there. Ogallala does, where there's been using and relying on that water pretty substantially. In other areas of the state, it is not as developed, but we do have the models in place and the technology in place to find that out. I think it's important to note, too, we talk a lot about irrigated agriculture. Most of that occurs in areas outside of the population centers of Texas. And so if you did stop irrigating for agriculture, that water is still a long way away, and it has tremendous cost of relocating that water to where the population centers are. And I think Laura really kind of defined the issue. There are different components, but it's really a lot of the same thing. And we, you know, there are multiple ways to solve our water dilemmas. Groundwater usage is part of that. Economics will come into play on where it's feasible to use certain kind of crops, where it's not. But technology, desalination, and just a variety of, and of course conservation too. With 26 million Texans, water conservation is huge. I think it's important to note that on an annual usage, homeowners use water at a higher rate than agriculture does. And so we have companies that are finding, better products, looking for more water efficient plants to use that will go a long way to where we need to be. But on groundwater particularly, I think recognizing that a landowner has an interest in that water will lead to a better use of that water, to make certain that water is used and cared for and managed properly because you have an interest in it. And nothing is an owner of property. There's no better steward than someone that has an interest in that property. So I think that's a good thing for Texas and can be used in an appropriate way.
Well, I think David Langford wants to chime in here, but the fact that a landowner has stewardship over the water under their property, that water could very well be connected to the water under their adjacent landowner's property and so on. So I think you wanted to chime in on that.
Well, my head's sitting here spinning about the things that have happened here today. One of the most important things, which I'm very gratified to see, when is the last time you were on a program where land and the water were mentioned on the same deal? I mean, normally they're not part of the same conversation. Also, Kate at one point this morning excluded conservation from the discussion. I realized why she did that, but I kept thinking that they're forgetting about one area of conservation, and that's those landowners that the Day case says own the water, who choose to conserve the water rather than to sell the water. Where are the rights? Where are the lines? What are the, where are we going legally, legislatively, society-wise? If our family chooses to conserve water, we don't want to sell the water. We have neighbors that do want to sell the water. So if that affects our property rights, how does that get settled? Right now, if our springs and windmills and creeks are diminished, I got to go sue the groundwater district. Do we want a system where my only remedy to protect my right to conserve is to go sue an entity of government? I'm not sure that's the right place to be in. I understand that I want to own that water, but what are my protections of wanting to own the water and wanting to conserve the water, which is a big part of conservation?
David, I think that's where we're maturing in our water laws in Texas. And a lot of that has to be defined by what is really beneath our water. Where are the hydrological studies? Where's that cone of depression to say, I really may not be using your water because of the way the flows are and how you're able to access that. So I think the state is another area that the state can help with, can assist with, in defining the types of groundwater that's available, the characteristics of that groundwater in certain region, and making that a priority in water management and water planning. I think that is very appropriate because policymakers are going to have to make some serious determinations about where we're going, and if we don't have the proper science, you can lead to some really bad conclusions and erosions of people's rights to access their water.
There's also some really positive stuff that's happening with cities in protection of both surface water and groundwater. And I just think it's very important that we don't say if it's groundwater, we must be talking about ag and ex-urban areas, and if it's surface water, we must be talking about cities, because that, first of all, is not how it works. City of San Antonio, for example, is primarily reliant on groundwater for its drinking water supply. And for a decade and a half, the voters in San Marcos have willingly authorized the use of a portion of that city's sales tax in an effort to protect the land in the aquifer as a strategy to protect the water in the aquifer, recognizing very directly that those natural systems on the land have everything to do with whether or not that water will be properly filtered when it goes into the aquifer. So, you know, the basic routine, 95% of the state is privately owned. The first place rain's going to fall is on private land. And in San Antonio, they've recognized that protecting that private land, either by purchasing it or a strategy I like even better, is by putting conservation easements on those lands so that you're working directly with private landowners so that they retain ownership of that land but become part of the conservation strategy. That has been in place in San Antonio, Hays County, Travis County, the city of Austin, and as a set of local governments, the citizens in this region have invested over $700 million in those land-based strategies, and it represents a best practice not only for the state of Texas but all over the country when we recognize that protecting land and keeping it in private ownership is an incredibly important way of protecting water.
And that's a much different approach to work with the landowners in cooperation with them rather than an antagonistic relationship that we find some solutions are, like in our current Endangered Species Act issues. There are not the opportunities to work with landowners as much as it should be in order to recovery there. And there's some great examples on how that's being done with water that I think that can be continued.
I agree.
Used.
Laura brings up a good point. Those programs, land-based conservation strategies that benefit water on private lands in particular, they are hugely popular. They pass with overwhelming majorities when they come to a vote and when they go to bond elections. And as part of SB3, as part of SB3, one of the things that was placed in that legislation, it is in the policy of the state, that those strategies, it's just the chairman right there who passed it, and the other chairman was here earlier this morning. It's the policy of the state to do that. Right there in the policy, it's a policy of the state of Texas to develop land-based conservation strategies that benefit water, and yet it's virtually non-existent in the state water plan. And yet it's the policy of the state to do exactly that.
And I'll make one other point, because I think this is a really important strategy for the state of Texas. It goes straight to water quality, but it also produces water quantity benefits. Local communities have figured out how to do this working with citizens. We could stand to have this strategy working in Dallas and in Houston. You'd structure it a little bit differently, but the value proposition would be the same. Protect the land, you'll protect the water. But also the food and beverage industry has stepped up to the plate in Texas. Coors, Coca-Cola, and Dr. Pepper have all invested real live money in these private protection funds so that you're doing good stewardship of the land in order to protect the watersheds. And by the way, they're utility customers. They could very easily say, this is not my problem, this is a utilities problem to solve, and then I'll buy the water at the back end of that deal. But they're not. They're making investments outside of the utility area so that they can be part of the land-based solution when it comes to water conservation. We need more of that in Texas.
There's Miller Coors doing exactly that in the Middle Trinity, and who is their partner in that process but the Sand County Foundation, Aldo Leopold. I mean, there it goes all the way back to the beginning, original founder of the philosophy of modern day conservation, and there is Miller Coors right alongside with the Sand County Foundation putting money on the ground for land-based conservation strategies that benefit water.
While we're talking about city use, I think we all know that during the summers, a lot of a city's water use is going to landscaping. And we've seen a situation in West Austin, for instance, where people are drilling their own private wells on their lot in order to water their lawns. What's it going to take for a larger cultural shift to happen in the state to move away from that kind of sort of attitude towards water? And is that even necessary?
I think it's occurring as we speak. I think it's going to be a slow process, but Scotch Miracle-Gro, Texas Nursery and Landscape Association, Texas Retailers Association all stepped forward and developed the Texas Water Smart campaign directly as a result of water restrictions that were being proposed in North Texas as a result of the zebra mussel in Lake Texoma. And it's a consumer education campaign that continues. I was at a field day, a turf and landscape field day at the College Station Texas A&M campus here a couple of weeks ago about using irrigation techniques and how much water you can save, how it reduces water runoff into our other streams that creates a whole new set of issues to have to deal with. So I think we're evolving there, and we're growing and we're maturing on ways to do it, but in ways that it saves money. I mean, you know, being water smart saves money, and I think we just have to, we can remind that to homeowners. And as the cost of water continues to rise, the cost of new sources of water continues to rise, it kind of rises on the level of priority for homeowners.
Another thing you can do in cities through utilities is to redesign rate structures, and I know this is one of those fascinating conversations. But the way that rate structures work right now when you have a conservation rate structure is essentially the higher the amount of water you use, the more you pay per block of water. And that's considered a conservation rate structure. So what is that structure doing philosophically? Well, it's going to the largest water user and saying you're going to pay a premium for those final blocks of water for being such a large water user. And there's an argument to be had that that will cause that group of users to use less water. But we don't do anything with the block of users that we represent. Just everyday people that are using water day in and day out may or may not be aware of what a conservation target would be. If we were to simply redesign our rate structures so that we would establish what a conservation usage would be and then rebate people for getting to that conservation usage. If you use 10% less water next year than you did this year, then you get some form of rebate, because essentially what you have done is you have sold back to the grid an amount of water that the city didn't have to produce. And by the way, that concept is alive and well in energy. If you use solar panels, then you've essentially sold back to the grid energy that doesn't have to be produced on your behalf. If we adopt that thinking to water, what we could do is then make conservation not just a movement in cities or an organization that you join in cities, but a completely different way that people look at consumption of water in cities. And ultimately, in my view, you know, growing the state from 25 million people to 50 million people means dialing back use. And we've just got to find ways to mainstream that.
Urban landscaping cuts across many sections of my heart. Our original ranch was 13,000 acres. It's been divided up over the years, but it's still owned by, except for a couple of hundred acres, it's still owned by family members. And we don't have any irrigation. We don't have any center pivots. We have no development. We have about a dozen permanent residences and a few hunting camps and some weekend homes. My mother drilled a well in 1963 at our house, and the water level remained constant in that well from 1963 to about 2000. From 2000 until now, our water level is down about 60 feet. So for the first 40 years of the well, it remained constant. For the next 10 or 12 years, it's down 60 feet. Part of that time, one of those instances, we had almost 50 inches of rain in 1 week, and it didn't bring the level of the well back up. We're in the Middle Trinity Aquifer, which only recharges at about 5% per year. But somebody's using that water. So all our neighbors have been there 6 or 7 generations, just like we have. They don't have any development, no center pivots. So the water's going somewhere. This brings the day case in. My personal opinion is, hopefully we can get the science to prove it eventually, is that it's going to water carpet grass in Bernie and Kerrville and San Antonio and New Braunfels and et cetera. Well, the numbers are pretty much that 40% of the treated water that's used is used for landscaping, and half of that water is wasted. So if we did nothing except stop wasting water on landscape, still keep the carpet grass green. If I lived in the city, I'd want my carpet grass green also. So if we did nothing more than that, maybe I don't know what we're going to do. You know, our creeks are dry, and it's not just drought. Block Creek, which flows 8 miles through our ranch, has been dry 4 times in my lifetime: 1956, 2009, 2011, 2012. I frankly see a pattern there. and it is, and Block Creek is totally spring-fed. And when the springs go, the ranch goes. So a sixth-generation heritage goes away because people are wasting money, people are wasting water on carpet grass. Now, I'm not sure I want to give up my family's heritage to wastewater, excess water, on carpet grass. If we need it to keep people alive, that's one thing. But to keep water running down the street because they're watering carpet grass too much in burning, that puts a whole different spin on the subject. So there's conservation, there's who owns the groundwater. All of these issues come into play in my family's history right today, now, drought or no drought.
And just a quick comment, because I think David's making a really important point, which is just because you have figured out a new way of supporting your old habits doesn't mean you've become a conservationist. So I'm fascinated by how many people think that because they've drilled a well and they're irrigating that same lawn with water that doesn't have to be treated by the city, they think that's the new conservation. You know, to some extent, even rainwater collection falls into this category. It's all about changing habits, not finding new ways to support old habits. That's what's got to shift about this conversation.
Well, there's actually a sign some of those people get for their lawn saying, "Don't yell at me for my green yard. It's, you know, watered by a private well." But it's an interesting distinction, like you said.
That doesn't work with me.
Yeah. So let's talk about conservation. I think up to a quarter of our future water supplies are supposed to come from conservation according to the state water plan. But how specific does it get? What does it really tell us about how we're going to achieve that?
There's a lot more specificity needed in the water plan in a lot of different areas. I mean, there are tangible projects that have been identified, but since you bring up the water plan, I mean, the biggest fallacy that I see with our water plan today is it's a great process, it is a good model, but you throw everything that you can think of in there and say, this is our plan, without any responsibility to come along with how we're going to fund that or how we're going to pay for it. And I think a change to our law should potentially be, when you submit a plan for the water plan, also submit a funding plan for that, so that we start that process early on. And then it would also kind of eliminate it would bring focus to those projects that would have the greatest yield for the best economic return, as I see it, in terms of the water plan.
So you think that funding should come locally?
I think the state has a role, as has been discussed, providing low-cost funds that are available. I think the state can be a deal closer for mega projects. But I think, you know, we would be shifting fundamentally if we were to say we're going to move away from the user pay system that we have today. And what do you say to water planners who have gone into bonded indebtedness, raised their local rates substantially high to pay for their projects, to go in and say we're going to have a new water tax or a new water fee, and guess what, thank you for stepping up, being a leader and solving your problems, but now we're going to tax you again twice. I think by having that type of discussion, it delays local entities from doing what they need to do. I've been on the local city council in Palestine, as we discussed, and good economic development means, as a community, you're going to have the water that you need to provide the jobs and the growth in your area and handle the capacity for your citizens. And so that is the primary responsibility, and we don't need to think that it's not going to be there. Now, there are strategic projects that benefit all of us in Texas, and we need to think about those on the table. But we can do that through our funding stream and not back away from the fact that it is ultimately the local entity, local water district's responsibility. And we've got great leaders in here who have done that for years and years, planned for water projects, financed water projects, and are delivering water projects. And we don't need to get away from that kind of a model, is what I'm suggesting.
I think there's a little bit of a catch-22 sitting in the water plan, and that is that the utilities actually were surveyed and asked, you know, what of this burden can you bear? And we know what that looks like. You go out and you issue bonds, and then you raise rates in order to pay back those bonds. That's how utilities pay for projects. And the utilities themselves told the state, I can't remember the exact number, but it was about $20 billion they were counting on the state to step up and provide. That's what we talk about when we talk about funding the state water plan. It's not the whole water plan that the state's going to be funding. It's a portion of it that utilities are going to be counting on. And the way that that's been done traditionally is through low interest rate or delayed deferred payment loan programs from the state of Texas. So in some ways, at the end of every day, utility customers will be paying for the state water plan. But I do think that those state programs can be incredibly important in, one, helping cities to do those big projects and do those projects that focus on conservation and reward them with lower interest rates or deferred payments as a mechanism to get some of these more innovative strategies in place, and as a mechanism to take that water plan, which is entirely unprioritized, and use money to push out the priorities. And so from my perspective, funding the water plan, we know we have to do that because the utilities are telling us there's only a portion of this burden that we can bear. But if you use that state role in order to promote innovation, in order to promote regional projects that utilities might not go to first, in order to promote real, live, performance-based conservation strategies, I think that's a good way for the state to use its role in this water plan.
I like going third. I just get to say, absolutely.
You're first next time.
I agree with everything that everybody has said. I'll make a disclaimer here first, because I do have some criticisms of the water plan. Hopefully they're constructive criticisms. I served for 10 years on the Regional Water Planning Group. I've been very close to the Cow Creek Groundwater District, Kendall County, which is the county that our family's ranch is in. And I have been involved ever since SB1 and understand completely and totally support the whole process. I think it's wonderful to have it locally driven and the plans filter up and then have holy water sprinkled on them from Austin. But there are a couple of things missing still. Number one is a legitimate, appropriate focus on land-based conservation efforts. And the other thing is, which is really, I think probably the legislature needs to remedy, and we talked about it, I think Senator Hager mentioned it again this morning, which is, or no, I guess it was Senator Avery that talked about a way to appeal the DFC process or to tweak the DFC process. And Jacob's Well, there sits David Baker right over there, a perfect example. Jacob's Well, and Andy talked about it also, where you drill a well upstream and you dry up the well and it doesn't matter because it's surface water versus groundwater. Here again, it's still the same water. But even more so than that, 2 feet of drawdown dries up Jacob's Well. GMA 9, I went to all of those meetings at GMA 9 and testified every time they offered public testimony. They voted, our members, our representatives on GMA 9 voted for an additional 30 feet of drawdown. So they voted on purpose to dry up Jacob's Well and destroy the economy of downtown Memberley. My family's already given 60 feet to GMA 9, and now they want us to give another 30 feet. Well, when the springs go and the wells go and the creeks go, we go as well, and it becomes another subdivision, and I guess that makes the developers and the taxing entities and the real estate community happy, but it doesn't make our family very happy.
Some of you might remember the town of Robert Lee, which is a town in West Texas that nearly went dry this year, and I was talking to the mayor out there earlier in the year, and he said, look, we had to put this emergency pipeline project that saved them from running out of water together ourselves, and got funding from different areas, but it was kind of up to us to solve this problem. Is it the small towns like that and the small rural communities that are most in danger from a lack of funding for the water plan? As cities, like you said, can have these big bond elections and that sort of thing to ensure their water supplies, but is it really kind of the small town part of Texas that stands to lose the most from a lack of funding?
I'm not going, your first day. Right.
Oh, that's right. Nice.
But once again, I go to my own personal experience. Sometimes it's their own fault. The closest, we are equidistant between Fredericksburg and Comfort, and that's kind of both ends of the spectrum. Fredericksburg has done a good job at planning for and accounting for their water. Comfort measures how much water they have by the capacity that they can pump. It doesn't matter that whether you got 10 gallons or 1,000,000 gallons, we ran the pumps at 30% today, or we ran the pumps at 40% today. That's how they measure whether they got enough water. So there's no thought or planning or even common sense that goes into how Comfort has its water supply for the people who live in Comfort.
I think the answer has to be no, that can't be the point of funding for the state water plan. And the reason is this, because 86% of Texans already live in one of our major urban centers. And as we move from 25 million people to 50 million people, they're all packing into cities. So, fundamentally the dynamic that we're working on is that cities have lost their ability, for the most part, to self-serve with local water supplies. You certainly see this up in the Dallas area. And so the reason that water has to, at some level, be both a local issue and a state issue is because the ability to use local supplies to solve your future problems is gone. And so the state funding has to be available and has to help address those major urban center issues as well as some of those ex-urban issues. It's not one versus the other.
Well, I want to make sure we have time for one last question for the panel before we go to a Q&A, and that is about climate change. The state climatologist, John Nielsen Gammon, has called it in Texas a force multiplier, and expanded on that, saying that it's going to lead to more fires, more evaporation, crops are going to need more water. A lot of the talk about the water plan and planning for our water future in Texas is focused on our growing population. But what about the likelihood of our extreme Texas weather becoming even more extreme because of climate change?
I think that we are contemplating those types of changes. I mean, David recounted the drought series and cycles that he's lived through on his family ranch, and this generation has endured. So I think we're contemplating for this cyclical changes in our climate. We know since the beginning of time we've gone through these eras, and we're certainly facing that here in Texas today. And our management strategy is to have water available for the drought of record. I mean, we plan for the worst case scenario, and when we plan for the worst case scenario and have adequate water supplies to meet during those times, then we don't have the economic losses and we don't have the tragedies that occur. So I think that we continuously reevaluate that every 5 years in our water plan to determine if we're headed toward the right mark, and if we're taking the changes into consideration.
I agree. I think that's a good point. I think the fact that we do our water planning based on the drought of record is really smart. I think the two things that we're going to have to rethink are how often and under what circumstances we see droughts. And it's instructive to me that the very first sentence of the state's water plan says during times of drought, we just don't have enough water to support the economy in the state of Texas. We know that right now. And our water plan states that to begin with. So at some, there's probably needs to be an eye towards what that new benchmark is for the state of Texas, because the one thing that is extraordinarily different about today than the drought of record in the 1950s is that there was less than 10 million people living in the state during the drought of record. And we've talked about this. We're moving from 25 million to 50 million people. So we've just got a lot more straws in the water, which should cause us to rethink how we peg water planning in Texas.
That's exactly right. As I said earlier, our whole family, for my lifetime, actually my parents' lifetime as well, we have planned for drought. And then we're surprised if it rains or if the market's good, and we plan for a bad market as well. So our total planning on the ranch is based on worst case scenarios, drought of record. And our consternation now is, it used to come with certain frequency. Now they're coming more frequently, so have to do to alter those plans to meet with a drought of record more frequently than we have had in the past. And frankly, it's tough because with the exception of those 4 years, 4 times, the last 3 being in the last 3 years, we've been able to count on water for our livestock because of our springs and because of the spring-fed creeks. Without that, then that has to change the whole equation somehow. And then you get into drilling wells into the groundwater, and then we're depleting one to fix another one. So we're breaking it on one end while we're trying to fix it on the other end. So we're going through that process right now, and I'm sure we will adjust. We had a record year last year. We made more profit in the livestock business and in the history of the ranch, and it was the driest year on history in the ranch also. So whatever we did right last year, we're going to try to keep doing right in the future.
Okay, thank you.